If you went to Sunday school, you think Jesus sandals were something your youth pastor wore. But actually, they play an important role in the Book of Ruth. Keep watching to find out why. Follow along as I read from Ruth chapter 4. Now Boaz had gone up to the gate and sat down there. And behold, the Redeemer, of whom Boaz had spoken, came by. So Boaz said, "Turn aside, friend, sit down here." And he turned aside and sat down. And he took 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. Then he said to the Redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, is selling the parcel of land that belonged to our relative Elimelech. So I thought I would tell you of it and say, buy it in the presence of those sitting here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. If you will not, tell me that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "The day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance." Then the Redeemer said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself," he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses this day, and I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses this day." Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily as Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you by this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." They named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez fathered Hezron. Hezron fathered Ram. Ram fathered Amminadab. Amminadab fathered Nahshon. Nahshon fathered Salmon. Salmon fathered Boaz. Boaz fathered Obed. Obed fathered Jesse, and Jesse fathered David. Hey everyone, welcome back to the last episode of the Book of Ruth. We are on the 4th and final chapter of this work. And although it's a very short book of the Bible, I hope you feel like we have covered some serious ground so far. Thinking back, we've gone all the way from connecting it to Mary and Martha, and even all the way back further through Genesis. The Book of Ruth is incredible, and I want you to start reading the Bible in this way. So let's get started on the 4th chapter. Now, where we left off, Ruth returned home from her overnight kind of gallivanting, and Naomi then encouraged her to be patient and to wait. And remember, she said that he will not rest until the matter is resolved today. And that matter was the kinsman redeemer. We talked about in that bonus episode how a kinsman redeemer was someone who was legally set aside to marry a widow of one of his relatives. And that is who Naomi and Ruth have named Boaz. But remember, when they spoke overnight, Boaz said, there is another redeemer in line. And that's something that we need to figure out. So, chapter 4, let's dive right in. So Boaz goes up to the city gates, and I love this, the Redeemer, he's not named, but the Redeemer stops by. I think it's I think it's interesting that he is not named, because he's the only character in this story not named. Even the dead have named. Even the foreigners have Hebrew names. So this man, the Redeemer, has not been named, and I think it's for a reason, which we'll discuss. Okay, so they're at the city gates, and Boaz says, come, sit down. And Boaz has brought elders to oversee this conversation, and they're going to get started. Now, something we haven't covered but is quite often taught with the Book of Ruth is the concept of noble character. And when Boaz describes Ruth as she approaches him, he calls her and names her a woman of noble character. Now, not in your Bible, but in a Jewish Bible and Jewish text, Ruth and Proverbs would have coincided. So when Boaz calls Ruth a woman of noble character, he's actually referencing Proverbs 31, the last chapter of the book of Proverbs. Okay? And if you're familiar with that, this chapter is often reserved for women's ministries and women's conferences, and it outlines what a noble character of a woman looks like, right? And they're quite literal examples, and that's another day to discuss. But I want you to know that across books of scripture, the language is used consistently to make connections for you as the reader. Now, in Proverbs 31, one of the descriptions of a woman of noble character is that her husband sits at city gates with elders. He's respected at city gates. So first I need you to see the entrance to a city and the city gates to be kind of an epicenter for these legal conversations and transactions. The presence of the elders would only further justify that conversation. So not only is Ruth a woman of noble character, as in a Proverbs 31 woman that Boaz has outlined chapters before, now we're seeing that Boaz is a man of noble character and is the husband, soon-to-be husband, of that wife of noble character, also outlined in Proverbs 31. Okay, so they are at the city gates, and basically Boaz gives this man the rundown. Naomi's back. And I wanted you to know that she's selling some of her land, and the land belonged to Elimelech. So as we are both relatives of Elimelech, you've got dibs. This is chapter 4, the second part of verse 4. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not, tell me, that I may know, for there is no one besides you to redeem it, and I come after you. So there's a hierarchy here. I don't know how it was lined up. I don't have any details on that. But Boaz is respecting that hierarchy and asking the unnamed redeemer, if you want this, go for it. If you don't, let me know, because I'm next in line. Now, there's something to see here. He tells the redeemer that Naomi's back, that she has land, that the redeemer has rights to, in some sense. There's no mention of Ruth. There's no mention of Elimelech's sons, who then married, whose wives are still living. He just says, there's land that was Elimelech's, and you're a redeemer, and I come after you. I find that to be interesting. Okay. Then he said, so after he lays all that out, but the catch is, this is verse 5, the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you also acquire Ruth the Moabite, the widow of the dead, in order to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. Okay, she's very clearly outlined to be a foreigner here. So while he was being a little bit mysterious before, now he's saying, if you buy the land, you also get Ruth, who's a foreign wife. Okay, what he's referencing in verse 5 is actually a law laid out in Deuteronomy chapter 25, which I made a separate episode on, that I highly recommend you watch, so that to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance. So as this unnamed redeemer, if you're going to step in to what should have been continued on as the line of Elimelech's, you do so in the name of Elimelech. It's not just buy this for your land and it adds to what you have and it's yours. No. You step in and continue on what Elimelech and then his sons, Mahlon and Chilion, started with his daughter-in-law, Ruth. Are you with me? Okay. Now, in verse in Deuteronomy 25, verses 5 through 10, the very last part of that chapter, it talks about should a redeemer deny this obligation to step in. And it says that it outlines a transaction, a removal of a sandal. The wife should come forward, remove the sandal from who should have been the redeemer, spit, and then forevermore, that redeemer would be known as, his family would be known as the family, the line, the house of the unsandaled. So there is a stigma there, there is a shame there with refusing this law, this ancient law. So chapter 4, this is Ruth, verse 6. Then the Redeemer said, I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I impair my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption yourself, for I cannot redeem it. Okay, no idea what that means. I can do some, I don't know how his inheritance would have been at stake should he marry Ruth and take this land. I really don't know. But it is important to understand that if he married Ruth and had a son, the firstborn son of that new marriage would not be considered his. It would be the child of Ruth's dead first husband. And that land would belong to that firstborn. So I don't know what he already has in motion on the side, but this over here is a threat to what he already has in motion. And so therefore he says, let me not uphold this law. Okay. Verse 7, this is going to help us understand Deuteronomy 25 a little more. Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm a transaction, the one drew off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the Redeemer said to Boaz, buy it for yourself, he drew off his sandal. Then Boaz said to the elders of all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have bought from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, and all that belonged to Chilion and to Mahlon. Also Ruth the Moabite, the widow of Mahlon, I have bought to be my wife, to perpetuate the name of the dead in his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brothers and from the gate of his native place. You are witnesses to this day. Okay, so what verse 7 is telling us is that the swapping of sandals is a legal transaction in a lot of ways. But what's interesting here is that what should have happened, considering Deuteronomy 25, is that Ruth would have removed the sandal from this unnamed redeemer. But that didn't happen. Instead, it's more of a transaction with Boaz, and then now everything is Boaz's. I don't know why. I'm not sure. Unless in verse 7 it's all to be understood that those two, one fulfills the other. That by Boaz removing the sandal or trading sandals, it fulfills Deuteronomy 25, maybe. But I do want you to pick up on those intricacies. Okay. Then all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you act worthily of Ephrathah and be renowned in Bethlehem. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring that the Lord will give you to this young woman, by this young woman. Okay, so much going on. So what's funny is that this is a small book and it's a small cast, but there's almost like a chorus of villagers in the background. I always think of it like, remember Beauty and the Beast? And it's that first scene, and she's like shopping for a book and avoiding Gaston, and then all of the little French village is behind her like singing along. I think that's kind of what's going on here, and we really don't see that these villagers more often, other than earlier when Naomi returns and she's in this like dramatic state and she's like, call me Mara. That's when we see the villagers that are kind of like, she's back, Naomi's back, and she's brought Ruth. So now all of a sudden this like background of Greek chorus shows up again, and they have this large blessing over Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. Okay, but to me, this blessing is very interesting, and I hope you saw the episode before concerning the breakdown of Tamar and Judah and how we got into this mess, because it comes into play here. So May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house, Ruth, like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel. Okay, if you remember, Jacob had, he had 4 wives. He had kids by 4 women. He had 2 wives. So remember, he wanted to marry Rachel, and he signed up for that 7-year strange, servant, indentured servanthood with Rachel's father, and he agreed that I'll work for 7 years in order to marry Rachel. And in the last minute, there's a little swap of daughters, and he ends up marrying Leah. And so for the stretch of that family, Rachel is clearly the desired and preferred wife. Leah's not as cute. That's biblical. And so Leah keeps having all these kids, even though she's not the preferred wife. And Rachel is the preferred wife and doesn't have children. And so what's weird is that the house of Israel, Jacob being Israel, is built on this 2-wife dynamic. But when they get to Ruth, centuries later, I shouldn't say centuries, generations later, Ruth is a foreign woman, and she's got this 2-husband dynamic in multiple ways. She loses her husband, then she loses her brother-in-law. Then over here, they're back in Bethlehem, and now there's 2 men in talks for her future and her marriage and her future. And so it's funny to me that they're comparing the woman to the tension of 2 wives decades before, when in reality we've got this tension of Boaz versus another man, Mahlon, who died, and this unnamed redeemer who's not fulfilling the law of God. So there's a preferred man here too, and that's such an interesting just nuance to the family of God. So okay, further into verse 11, may you act worthily of Ephrathah. You might remember in the first chapter, we talked about Elimelech and Naomi being Ephrathites. That is a woman in genealogy who lived in, basically it just means descendants of her, and those people live in Bethlehem. So they're bringing in this foreign wife and giving her the historical identity of a Hebrew woman, of an Israelite woman. She's in it now. There's no turning back. They're claiming her. May you be like Rachel and Leah, who were so upheld. And then further back, may you be like this woman who is kind of like a landmark for the town of Bethlehem. So not only will you be an Israelite, will you be a pillar in this specific community. And may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because the offspring of that the Lord will give you by this young woman. In that bonus episode, we discussed that Levirate marriage, I don't know how you say it, really went askew in this dynamic between Tamar and Judah in Genesis 38. But now that moment's being glorified because Perez was the fruit of that, one of the twins, and may your house be like the house of Perez. And so it's this very climactic moment where it's all okay. And it's all resolved, and this foreign wife is made an Israelite. She's in the covenant. She's the wife of Boaz, this upstanding man at city gates. They're both of noble character, and may they have this full blessing by the villagers. Okay, so verse 13, this is the end. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. The Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a redeemer. May his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the woman of the neighborhood, back to our chorus, gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Okay, so if you remember a few episodes back, well, really the first few episodes, we talked about, literarily speaking, in the literature of the Book of Ruth, there is this push and pull, this kind of ebb and flow of full and empty throughout the Book of Ruth. We started in total depravity and famine in the house of bread, just gone. Everybody's dead. Well, not everybody, but 3 men are dead, and there's nothing to be had. Fast forward to the end of the 4th chapter, and now there's complete and total fullness. You know, the harvests have come. The house of bread is full again, and now it's bearing fruit in the name of Obed. And everything Naomi lost has been restored in her old age. She lost her husband, she lost her sons, but now she's been given a new one through this daughter-in-law who's worth to her more than 7 sons. Remember, 7 being that number of completion and perfection. And so the woman that ran from the provision of God and sent her daughter-in-laws back to their pagan homes, and called herself Mara, the only person to rename herself, call herself Mara, now has total fulfillment. She has a redeemer. She has her land, her property. It's still in her husband's name, and she has this grandson that she never would have had before. Okay, so just something fun to note. These last few verses, 16 through 21, could not have been added by the original author of the Book of Ruth. It's a genealogy from Boaz to David, and it hasn't happened yet by the end of Ruth. So it's believed that that was added on later by somebody else. Okay, let's talk about kind of the theme of clothing in this part of Ruth. We discussed the logistics of a sandal, which is very important here because it fulfills the law, and it fulfills the brokenness between Judah and Tamar. And in that bonus episode, we discussed how Ruth and Tamar both dressed differently. Both dressed up to go meet the father of their child and the provider in this moment. Tamar changed to become a prostitute. Ruth anointed herself. Very different. When she gets to Boaz, she says, it's chapter 3, she says spread, it depends on your translation, but some say spread your cloak, the corner of your cloak, and spread your wings, and that's because that language is intertwined. So if you have cloak, spread the corner of your cloak, it's to signify the image of wings. It's to reckon back to this provision language that's used before the Book of Ruth. As we look forward, clothing is consistently used, specifically clothing around a woman, to signify redemption and healing and reunion. When we get to Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel, remember, he's a prophet, and it's a prophet when Jerusalem has fallen and is no longer upholding the law of God. And in Hosea too, that idea of an adulterous wife is used to symbolize sinfulness. And Jerusalem is often referred to in the feminine. And in Ezekiel, he talks about Jerusalem as an adulterous wife. And in that chapter, what he discusses is a reclothing of Jerusalem, and she is cleaned up and made new and becomes beautiful and becomes a queen in that passage. And so Ruth is asking for covering, literally, from Boaz, that also speaks to the covering of provision. And then in her new dress, in her anointed state, in the morning when she sneaks away, remember, he provides for her, but he gives her that grain in her cloak. Excuse me. So this is again in chapter 3, verse 15. And he said, "Bring the garment you are wearing and hold it out." So she held it, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went into the city. So again, he's providing more than he already has, and it's kind of this agreement. And clothing is a big part of that, And then you get to the end of the book, and there's a trading of clothing going on, trading of covering. And remember, with Adam and Eve in Genesis, they eat the apple and they realize they're naked, and they hide. They make, fig leaves, and they hide. And then God, still walking in the garden, walking with them in the garden, comes up and makes clothing for them. And we believe that, it says animal skins, it says skins, and that requires a sacrifice. He's got to kill part of his creation in order to cover the headship of his creation that's forsaken him. And so I want you to see the connection between Adam and Eve in Genesis, the prophecy in Ezekiel of Jerusalem being fallen, and even in this moment, a foreign wife approaching her Redeemer and being covered in his provision. And it's a double portion. It's more than just anything. She becomes beautiful. And as we look, she was pretty anyway, but as we get at the end of chapter 4, she is set up to be like a queen, like that Ezekiel passage, because we've got that whole genealogy to come. And Ruth, who was a Moabite, totally an enemy of Israel, is now like some great-great-great-grandmother of King David and a great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother of Christ. And so I want you to see the end of Ruth to be incredibly poetic and incredibly almost musical, where, when she broke bread with Boaz and his team while they were gleaning, and that's kind of a foreshadowing of heaven on earth. The same thing is happening here. The gospel is that you who were once a foreigner, who've fallen away, who were an adulterous wife, there has been a sacrifice made. And as you approach your Redeemer, out of his sacrifice, you're clothed and made new and made like royalty. And that's what I want you to see from the Book of Ruth. It's incredibly intricate in regards to where it sits in the canon, in regards to where it sits in the Bible, but it is the gospel. Maybe more obviously so than many other books. It is just black and white from a macro perspective. It is the gospel. It's an absolute foreshadowing of Christ, and an absolute foreshadowing of Revelation, and what we as Christians can expect to come. So that's all I have for the Book of Ruth. I hope you enjoyed it as thoroughly as I have. It's been an honor, and I can't wait to join you again soon with a whole other book of the Bible. Thanks.